Some mistakes follow you to the grave, no matter how far you run. Augustus Bennett learned this truth 23 years ago when he walked away from everything he loved to protect it from the violence that followed him like a shadow. Now he lives alone in the frozen mountains of Idaho Territory, where the only sounds are wind through pine trees and the echo of regrets that never fade. On a bitter December morning in 1881, a young woman named Vivian appears at his cabin door. She wears just a thin dress against the mountain cold and carries 3 old books like precious treasures. Her request is simple. "Come live with me for just one day." Gus agrees, thinking he's helping a stranger. He has no idea that Vivian knows exactly who he is, or that this single day will force him to face the family he abandoned long ago. What happens when the past you've been running from finally catches up? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind had been howling for 3 days straight, and Augustus Bennett welcomed it. Up here on Widow's Ridge, 8,000 feet above the valley floor, the wind was honest. It didn't lie or make promises it couldn't keep. It just blew, cold and clean, carrying the scent of snow and pine and nothing else. He stood at the single window of his cabin, watching snowflakes dance in the gray morning light. His reflection stared back, weathered face, steel-gray beard, eyes that had seen too much. At 62, Augustus moved with the careful precision of a man who'd learned that survival depended on every small decision. The coffee in his tin cup had gone cold while he watched the storm, but he didn't mind. Hot coffee was a luxury, not a necessity. The cabin itself told the story of a man who'd stripped life down to its essentials. One room, built solid with his own hands from lodgepole pine. A stone fireplace that drew well and kept the worst of the cold at bay. A narrow bed with wool blankets. A table he'd hewn from a single piece of oak, scarred now from years of use. And in the corner, his hand-carved chess set, the one indulgence he'd allowed himself in 23 years of exile. The chess pieces were works of art, each one carved with the patient skill of a man who had nothing but time. The White King bore a noble face. The queen stood tall and proud, and the pawns looked ready for battle. Augustus had carved them during his first winter here, when the loneliness threatened to drive him mad. Playing against himself had become a ritual, a way to keep his mind sharp when conversation was a memory. He'd learned to live with silence the way other men learned to live with wives. It had taken years to stop listening for footsteps that would never come, voices that would never call his name. The mountain had taught him patience, and patience had taught him peace, or something close to it. But this morning felt different. Augustus couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, the way animals sensed storms before the first clouds appeared. He'd survived this long by trusting his instincts, and his instincts were telling him to pay attention. The memories came anyway, the way they always did when the wind picked up. Margaret's laugh, bright as silver bells. The way she'd hum while cooking, her hands graceful as she kneaded bread. The curve of her back as she bent over her sewing, auburn hair catching the lamplight. They'd had 9 months together before everything went to hell. 9 months that felt like 9 lifetimes now. He'd been different then, Augustus Caldwell, not Bennett. The name change had been necessary after he'd fled, along with the beard and the mountain hermit act. Back then, he'd been clean-shaven and quick to smile, earning his living with a gun but trying to build something better. Margaret had seen past the violence to the man underneath. She'd believed he could change, and for a while so had he. The baby would have been born in spring. Margaret had placed his hand on her belly one evening, eyes shining with joy and terror in equal measure. "Feel that," she'd whispered. "Our little one's saying hello." The flutter beneath his palm had been so faint he'd wondered if he'd imagined it. Now he knew he hadn't. That tiny life had been real as the choice he'd made to protect it by walking away. The Thornfield gang had been closing in. 3 of them had already died by Augustus's hand, and the rest wanted blood. They'd made it clear that anyone connected to him would pay the price. So he'd done the only thing a man could. who loved someone more than his own life, he disappeared. Into the wilderness and disappeared. The knock on his door came so softly he almost missed it over the wind. Augustus froze, tin cup halfway to his lips. In 23 years, no one had knocked on that door. Trappers and hunters sometimes passed through the area, but they knew better than to approach the hermit's cabin uninvited. The locals in Millbrook, the closest settlement 15 miles down the mountain, told stories about the wild man who lived on Widow's Ridge. Most of them were smart enough to leave those stories alone. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Augustus set down his cup and reached for the Winchester leaning against the wall beside the door. Not because he planned to use it, but because 23 years of solitude hadn't made him stupid. He checked the action, smooth and ready, then moved to the window for a better view. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. A young woman stood on his doorstep, shivering in the wind. She couldn't have been more than 25, with dark hair that whipped around her face and a dress that belonged in a parlor, not on a mountain in December. She carried 3 thick books pressed against her chest like a shield, and when she looked up at the window, Augustus saw eyes the color of deep water, familiar eyes that made his heart skip. He opened the door before he could think better of it. "Sir," she said, her voice steady despite the cold that had to be cutting through her thin dress like a knife. "I'm sorry to disturb you. My name is Vivian, and I have a request that might sound strange." Augustus stared at her, unable to speak. Up close, she was even more striking. High cheekbones, a determined chin, and something in her bearing that spoke of inner strength. But it was those eyes that held him frozen. He'd seen those eyes before, in another face, in another lifetime. "You're not dressed for this weather," he managed to say. "No, sir, I'm not." She looked him straight in the eye, unflinching. "But I had to come. I had to ask you something important." "Ask me what?" Vivian took a deep breath, snowflakes settling on her dark hair like tiny stars. "Come live with me for just one day, back at my home. That's all I ask." The request was so unexpected, so completely out of place in his carefully ordered existence, that Augustus felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "I beg your pardon?" "One day," she repeated. "I have a comfortable home down in the valley. Good food, a warm fire, and all I want is for you to stay with me for 24 hours. After that, you can come back here, and I promise I'll never bother you again." Augustus studied her face, looking for deception, madness, anything that would explain this impossible moment. "Why?" "Because I need to know something," Vivian said simply. "And I think you do too." The wind gusted between them, and Augustus realized he was letting heat escape from his cabin while this young woman froze on his doorstep. Whatever game she was playing, whatever she wanted from him, he couldn't let her stand out here and catch her death. "Come inside," he said, stepping back from the door. "We can talk where it's warm." "Thank you." Vivian stepped across the threshold, and Augustus caught a scent that made his knees weak. Lavender soap and something else. Something that reminded him of Margaret so strongly he had to grip the doorframe for support. She looked around the cabin with curious eyes, taking in the sparse furnishings, the chess set, the rifle he'd left leaning against the wall. If she was afraid of him, she didn't show it. "Coffee?" Augustus asked, because he didn't know what else to say. That would be kind. He poured her a cup from the pot that stayed warm on the stove, hands steady despite the chaos in his mind. When he handed it to her, their fingers brushed, and he felt a jolt of recognition so strong it nearly knocked him over. "Your hands," Vivian said quietly, looking down at his weathered fingers. "They're just like I imagined they'd be." "What do you mean?" She wrapped both hands around the tin cup, warming them, and gave him a smile that was sad and hopeful at the same time. "I mean, I've been looking for you for a very long time, Augustus Bennett. Or should I say Augustus Caldwell?" The coffee cup slipped from Augustus's suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering on the cabin floor. "Who are you?" he whispered. Vivian set down her own cup and looked him in the eye. "I'm the daughter of Margaret Pemberton, the daughter you never knew existed. And yes, I'll come live with you for just one day, because there are things you need to know and things I need to understand." Will you come? Augustus felt 23 years of carefully built walls crumble around him. Outside, the wind howled like all the ghosts of his past coming home to roost. And for the first time since he'd climbed this mountain, Augustus Bennett was afraid. The walk down the mountain took 2 hours, and every step felt like a journey backward through time. Augustus followed Vivian along paths he hadn't traveled in over 2 decades, his snowshoes breaking trail through drifts that reached his knees. She moved with surprising confidence for someone in a dress, as if she'd made this climb before. Neither of them spoke much during the descent. What was there to say? Augustus's mind reeled with questions he didn't know how to ask, while Vivian seemed content to let the mountain air speak for itself. But when they reached the tree line and the valley spread out below them, Augustus stopped dead in his tracks. "Sweet Lord," he breathed. The valley looked almost exactly as he remembered it. Rolling meadows stretched between stands of aspen and pine, their snow-covered branches etched against a grey sky. A stream wound through the center like a silver ribbon, and there, nestled in a grove of cottonwoods, sat a house that made Augustus's heart clench with recognition. It was Margaret's house. Their house, for the brief time they'd shared it. The same white clapboard siding, the same green shutters, the same wide porch where they'd sat in the evenings, planning their future. Someone had added a new roof and painted the trim, but the bones of the place remained unchanged. "You've been taking care of it," Augustus said, his voice rough with emotion. "Mother left it to me," Vivian replied, "along with some other things I think you'll recognize." They approached the house slowly, Augustus's feet growing heavier with each step. The front gate still squeaked on its hinges, a sound that transported him back to autumn evenings, when he'd come home to find Margaret waiting on the porch. Her face lighting up at the sight of him, Vivian opened the front door and stepped aside to let him enter first. "Welcome home," she said quietly. The interior hit Augustus like a physical blow. The same hardwood floors, polished to a warm shine. The same stone fireplace where he'd proposed to Margaret on a cold February night. The same kitchen table where they'd shared breakfast and dreams of the family they'd planned to build together. But it was the small details that nearly broke him. The quilt Margaret had been working on, now finished and draped over the back of the sofa. The rocking chair he'd made for her, its arms worn smooth by years of use. And there, on the mantelpiece, a photograph he'd never seen before. Margaret holding a baby with dark hair and familiar eyes. "That's me," Vivian said, following his gaze. "I was about 6 months old when that was taken. Mother said I had your stubborn chin even then." Augustus reached for the frame with shaking hands. The woman in the photograph was unmistakably Margaret, though she looked tired in a way he'd never seen before. The baby in her arms stared at the camera with solemn eyes, one tiny fist pressed against her mother's chest. "She never told me," Augustus whispered. "In her letters, she never said—" "What letters?" Augustus looked up to find Vivian watching him intently. "The ones she sent to the post office in Millbrook. I wrote down every few months to check, hoping—" He stopped, understanding dawning on his face. "You don't know about the letters. Mother never mentioned any letters." Vivian set her 3 books on the kitchen table, handling them like precious artifacts. "But then, there were a lot of things she didn't tell me. Things I only learned after she died last spring." The news hit Augustus like a physical blow. He sank into the rocking chair, the same chair he'd built with his own hands, and felt the weight of 23 years settle on his shoulders like lead. "How?" he asked. "Fever. It came on fast, and by the time the doctor arrived from town, there wasn't much he could do." Vivian's voice was steady, but Augustus could see the pain in her eyes. She was conscious until the end. Kept talking about things that didn't make sense, about a man who carved horses, about letters that never found their way home. "She made me promise to find you." Augustus closed his eyes, remembering. The wooden horse, he'd started carving it during their last week together, intending it as a gift for the baby. He'd left it unfinished when he fled, another dream abandoned in his wake. "She kept it," Vivian continued, and Augustus opened his eyes to see her holding something wrapped in faded cloth. "Mother saved everything you left behind. Said someday you'd come back for them." Vivian unwrapped the cloth to reveal a small wooden horse, its mane half-carved, its eyes still blank wood. Augustus had worked on it by lamplight while Margaret slept, his hands moving automatically while his mind wrestled with the decision that would tear them apart. "I finished it," Vivian said, and Augustus saw that someone had indeed completed his work. The horse's eyes held gentle wisdom now. Its mane flowed like captured wind, and its hooves seemed ready to gallop across imaginary meadows. "Mother taught me to carve when I was little. Said my father had good hands, and maybe I'd inherited them." Augustus took the horse from her hands, running his fingers over the smooth wood. It was beautiful work, far better than anything he could have managed. Vivian had taken his rough beginning and turned it into something magical. "Why now?" he asked. "Why come looking for me after all these years?" Vivian pulled out a chair and sat across from him at the kitchen table. "Because of these." She opened the first of her 3 books, revealing pages covered in Margaret's careful handwriting. Mother's journals. 23 years' worth of letters she wrote to you, but never sent. Augustus's hands tightened on the wooden horse. "Letters? Every week, sometimes every day. She'd sit at this table and write to you like you were coming home for dinner. Told you about the crops, about me growing up, about the town gossip and the weather and how much she missed you." Vivian's voice caught slightly. "She never stopped believing you'd come back." The second book contained maps and sketches, crude drawings of the mountain passes, notes about which trails led where, estimates of travel time from the valley to various peaks. Margaret had been trying to find him, Augustus realized. For over 20 years, she'd been planning a journey she'd never had the courage to make. "And this one," Vivian said, opening the 3rd book, "is mine." The pages were filled with Vivian's own handwriting, but the content made Augustus's blood run cold. Newspaper clippings about the Thornfield gang, wanted posters with his name and description, court records from trials that had taken place years after he'd disappeared. And underneath it all, Vivian's careful notes and conclusions. "You were innocent," she said simply. "The bank robbery in Carson City, the one that made you run, you didn't do it. The real thieves were caught 6 months after you disappeared. They confessed to everything, including framing you." Augustus stared at the pages, his vision blurring. "That's not possible." "It's all here. Court transcripts, witness statements, everything. The judge who signed your death warrant was taking bribes from the Thornfield gang. They needed a scapegoat, and you were convenient." Vivian reached across the table and touched his hand. "You've been hiding for nothing, Augustus. You could have come home years ago." The wooden horse slipped from Augustus's nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor. 23 years. 23 years of exile, of loneliness, of believing he was protecting Margaret and their child by staying away. 23 years of Margaret sitting at this table, writing letters to a ghost, never knowing that her ghost was innocent. "She died believing I'd abandoned her," Augustus whispered. "No." Vivian's voice was firm. "She died believing you'd loved her enough to sacrifice everything to keep her safe. That's what I need you to understand. Mother never felt abandoned. She felt cherished, protected. And when I read these journals, when I understood what really happened, I knew I had to find you." Augustus looked around the room that held so many memories, at the young woman who carried Margaret's eyes and his stubborn chin, at the life he'd thrown away for nothing. The weight of it was crushing, but underneath the grief, something else was stirring. Something that felt dangerously like hope. "One day," he said, his voice hoarse. "You said one day." Vivian nodded. 24 hours, long enough for you to see what your sacrifice protected, what it built. Long enough for me to understand the man my mother never stopped loving." She paused, then added softly, "Long enough for us to decide if we want to be a family." Outside, snow began to fall again, dusting the windows of the house where Augustus had once believed in tomorrow. He'd agreed to one day, but already he could feel the past and present colliding in ways that might change everything. The question was whether he was brave enough to let them. Dinner was a quiet affair, but it was the comfortable kind of quiet that settles between people who are learning to know each other. Vivian had prepared a simple meal, venison stew, fresh bread, and coffee that tasted better than anything Augustus had brewed in his cabin. She moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, and Augustus found himself watching her hands as she worked. They were Margaret's hands, he realized, long-fingered and graceful, but stronger than her mother's had been. "You're staring," Vivian said without turning around. "Sorry, it's just you have her way of moving. The way she'd tilt her head when she was thinking, the way she'd hum under her breath." Augustus paused, then added, "I keep expecting her to walk through that door. I used to feel the same way. After she died, I'd hear footsteps on the porch and think she was coming home from the garden." Vivian ladled stew into 2 bowls and brought them to the table. "Time helps, but it doesn't heal everything." They ate in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the clink of spoons against ceramic and the whisper of wind around the eaves. Augustus found himself studying the room, noting changes and additions that spoke of lives lived in his absence. New curtains at the windows, cheerful yellow calico that Margaret would have loved. A shelf of books by the fireplace, their spines worn from frequent reading. And tucked in the corner near the stove, a child's wooden toy horse, not the one he'd carved, but another one. "Smaller and painted bright red. I made that when I was 7, Vivian said, following his gaze. "Mother taught me to carve like I told you, but she also taught me to paint. Said you'd appreciate the bright colors." Augustus set down his spoon. "She talked about me. Every day, she'd tell me stories about the man who built this house, who planted the apple trees behind the barn, who promised to teach his children to fish in the creek." Vivian's eyes were soft with memory. "She never called you by name in front of others, but when it was just us, you were always your father or the man I loved." The words hit Augustus like a physical blow. All these years, he'd imagined Margaret trying to forget him, maybe even hating him for disappearing. The idea that she'd kept his memory alive, that she'd made sure their daughter knew about him, was almost too much to bear. "What did she tell you about why I left?" Vivian was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. "She said you were a good man who'd done hard things, and that sometimes good men have to make terrible choices to protect the people they love. She said you'd gone away to keep us safe, and that someday, when it was right, you'd find your way home." Augustus pushed his bowl away, his appetite gone. "She made me sound like a hero. I was just a coward who ran when things got difficult. Were you?" Vivian challenged. "Because from where I'm sitting, walking away from everything you loved to keep your family safe, sounds pretty heroic to me. You don't understand. The things I did before I met your mother, I know what you did." Vivian's voice was firm. "I've read the court records, remember? You were a bounty hunter who brought in men the law couldn't touch. You killed people, yes, but they were killers themselves. Men who preyed on the innocent." She leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Mother knew all of that when she fell in love with you. It didn't change how she felt." Augustus stood abruptly and walked to the window, needing distance from the conversation and the emotions it stirred. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the valley in peaceful white. It was the kind of evening when he and Margaret used to sit on the porch, planning their future and believing it would last forever. "There's something else," Vivian said quietly. "Something I haven't shown you yet." Augustus heard her moving around the room, the sound of a drawer opening, papers rustling. When he turned back, she was holding a small wooden box, its surface polished smooth with age. Mother kept this on her dresser, said it held her most precious treasures. Vivian opened the box, revealing an assortment of small objects. "Look!" Inside, Augustus saw his old shaving brush, the one he'd left behind in his haste to flee. A pressed flower, the first wildflower he'd ever given Margaret, now brown and fragile with age. A piece of paper with measurements written in his hand, notes for a cradle he'd planned to build. And there, nestled among these remnants of their shared life, was a ring, Margaret's wedding ring. The simple gold band he'd placed on her finger the night before he'd disappeared, promising her a lifetime of tomorrows he'd never been able to deliver. "She never took it off," Vivian said softly. "Even when the other women in town whispered about her being abandoned, even when Mr. Patterson at the bank suggested she might want to consider herself a widow and remarry. She wore your ring until the day she died. Augustus reached for the ring with trembling fingers. It was warm from Vivian's hand, heavier than he remembered. Inside the band, he could just make out the inscription he'd had the jeweler engrave. "Forever Augustus," I thought. Augustus had to stop, clear his throat, try again. "I thought she'd hate me for leaving." "How could she hate you for the greatest act of love she'd ever known?" Vivian closed the box gently. She understood Augustus, maybe not at first, but as the years passed and she learned more about the men who'd been hunting you, she understood. "You gave up everything so we could have everything." The weight of 23 years of guilt and loneliness pressed down on Augustus's shoulders. He'd carried the burden of his decision every day, believing he'd destroyed the woman he loved, that he'd condemned his unborn child to grow up fatherless and bitter. To learn that Margaret had not only forgiven him, but honored his memory, that she'd raised their daughter to understand and respect his choice. It was almost too much grace to accept. "She must have been lonely," he said. "Sometimes. But she had me, and she had this place, and she had her faith that someday you'd come home." Vivian moved to stand beside him at the window. She used to say that love wasn't about being together every day. It was about being willing to sacrifice for each other's happiness. She said you'd already proven your love in the biggest way possible. Augustus stared out at the snow-covered yard, remembering summer evenings when he'd worked in the garden while Margaret hung laundry on the line. Simple moments that had seemed unremarkable at the time but now felt precious beyond measure. "What about you?" he asked. "Growing up without a father, that couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't always easy, no. But Mother made sure I never felt unwanted or unloved. She told me every day that I was the best of both my parents, that I carried your strength and her wisdom." Vivian smiled, the expression that transformed her serious face. "Besides, I had half the men in town ready to play father when I needed one. Mr. Jameson taught me to ride, Doc Harrison taught me to read Latin, and old Pete at the livery stable taught me words Mother definitely didn't approve of." Despite everything, Augustus found himself smiling back. "Sounds like you had quite a childhood." "I did. Different from what it might have been, but good in its own way." Vivian touched his arm gently. "The question is, what kind of life do we build from here?" Augustus looked down at Margaret's ring, still clasped in his palm, and wondered if it was possible for a man to come back from the dead twice in one lifetime. Augustus woke before dawn, as he had every day for the past 23 years. But instead of the familiar confines of his mountain cabin, he found himself in a real bed with clean sheets and a quilt that smelled faintly of lavender. For a moment, he lay still in the pre-dawn darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a house settling around him, the creak of timber, the whisper of wind through proper eaves, the distant tick of a clock marking time in a world where time mattered. The guest room Vivian had prepared for him was small but comfortable, furnished with pieces he half remembered from his brief time in this house. The washstand by the window had been Margaret's grandmother's, he recalled, and the mirror above it had reflected his face in happier times. Now it showed him a stranger, a grizzled mountain man with wild hair and eyes that had seen too much solitude. Downstairs, he could hear Vivian moving around the kitchen, the soft clatter of dishes and the whistle of a kettle coming to boil. Domestic sounds that stirred memories he'd thought buried forever. He dressed quickly in the clothes she'd laid out for him. His own clothes, he realized with a start, garments he'd left behind that Margaret had carefully preserved. The shirt was loose on his frame now, his mountain life having carved away the softer flesh of his younger years. But it still fit well enough. When he came downstairs, Vivian was standing at the stove, her dark hair pinned up in a practical bun, wearing a simple blue dress that made her look older than her years. She turned when she heard his footsteps, offering him a smile that was warm but cautious. "Coffee's ready," she said, "and I thought we might take a walk around the property before the day gets busy. There are things I'd like to show you." They stepped out into the crisp morning air, their breath forming clouds in the cold. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving the world transformed into a pristine wonderland. Augustus followed Vivian along paths that had once been as familiar to him as the lines on his own hands, noting the changes that 23 years had wrought. The barn looked solid and well-maintained, its red paint fresh and bright against the snow. Behind it, the apple orchard he'd planted stood in neat rows, the trees mature now and heavy with the promise of future harvests. Someone had added a chicken coop and a small smokehouse, practical additions that spoke of self-sufficiency and careful planning. "You've done well with the place," Augustus said, as they walked between the apple trees. Their branches were bare now, but he could imagine them in spring, heavy with blossoms and buzzing with bees. "Mother and I worked hard to keep it going," Vivian replied. "We learned to do most things ourselves. Fix fences, tend livestock, manage the orchard. Mother said you'd built something worth preserving, and she was determined to prove it." They stopped at a small fenced area near the creek, where Augustus saw something that made his throat tighten with emotion. 3 simple wooden crosses marked graves in the family plot, one larger than the others, flanked by 2 smaller ones. "Mother's buried there," Vivian said quietly. "Next to your parents." Augustus stared at the graves, confusion replacing his initial grief. "My parents? But they're buried in Missouri, where I was born." "No, they're not." Vivian's voice was gentle but firm. "Mother had them moved here about 10 years ago. She said when you came home, you'd want your family all in one place." The revelation hit Augustus like a physical blow. Margaret had somehow located his parents' graves in Missouri and arranged to have them reinterred here in the valley they'd chosen as home. It was an act of faith and love so profound that Augustus had to grip the fence rail to steady himself. How did she manage it? The expense alone. She sold some of her mother's jewelry and used the money to hire a proper undertaker. Took her 2 years to save up for it, but she said it was important. Vivian touched his arm gently. "She wanted you to know that this was your real home, that your family was here waiting for you." Augustus walked through the gate and approached the graves. His parents' headstones were simple but dignified, carved with their names and dates, and underneath, a single line, "Beloved parents of Augustus Caldwell." Margaret's stone was larger, more elaborate, with an inscription that made Augustus's eyes blur with tears. "Margaret Pemberton Caldwell, beloved wife and mother." "She kept the faith." "Caldwell?" Augustus asked, his voice hoarse. "She took your name when you disappeared. The preacher wouldn't perform a ceremony without the groom present, but Mother said she was your wife in the eyes of God, and that was enough." Vivian knelt and brushed snow from Margaret's headstone. The whole town thought she was foolish, but she didn't care. She said a promise was a promise, even if only one person was left to keep it. Augustus sank to his knees beside Margaret's grave, overcome by the magnitude of her faith and devotion. All these years, he'd carried the guilt of abandoning her, of leaving her to face the world alone. But she'd never been alone. She'd carried him with her every day, in her name, in her faith, in the life she'd built around his memory. "I should have come back sooner," he whispered. "I should have found out the truth about the robbery, should have fought to clear my name." "Should-haves don't change anything," Vivian said firmly. "What matters is what we do now." A sound from the direction of the house made them both look up. A wagon was approaching along the main road, its driver hunched against the cold. As it drew closer, Augustus could see it was an older man with a familiar face, Doc Harrison, if his memory served. "Morning, Vivian," the doctor called as he pulled up to the front gate. "Brought those medicines you asked for?" He stopped mid-sentence as his eyes fell on Augustus. "Well, I'll be damned." "Augustus Caldwell, as I live and breathe." Augustus rose slowly, brushing snow from his knees. There was no point in denying his identity. Doc Harrison had delivered half the babies in the county and had a memory like a steel trap. "Doc," Augustus said simply. "Heard you were dead," the old physician said, climbing down from his wagon with the careful movements of a man whose joints ached in the cold. "Been hearing that for years, matter of fact. Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated." Doc Harrison laughed, a sound like rusty hinges. Margaret always said you'd come back someday. Glad to see the woman had good judgment. His expression grew more serious. Sorry for your loss, son. She was a fine woman, your Margaret. This whole valley mourned when she passed. Thank you, Augustus managed. You planning to stay? The doctor asked bluntly. Augustus glanced at Vivian, who was watching him with those familiar eyes. I'm not sure yet. Well, when you decide, know that you've got friends here. Margaret made sure of that. Spent 23 years telling anyone who'd listen about the good man who'd loved her enough to sacrifice everything for her safety. Doc Harrison gathered his reins. Funny thing about the truth, it has a way of outlasting lies. As the wagon disappeared down the road, Augustus realized that his secret was already spreading through the valley like ripples on a pond. By evening, everyone would know that the ghost of Augustus Caldwell had returned to the land of the living. By noon, the visitors had started arriving. Word traveled fast in a small valley, and it seemed half the county wanted to get a look at the man who'd come back from the dead. Augustus watched from the kitchen window as riders and wagons approached the house, some driven by curiosity, others by genuine affection for Margaret's memory. The first to arrive was Martha Henley, the postmistress from Millbrook, a woman Augustus remembered as having opinions about everything and the backbone to express them. She marched up to the front door like a general preparing for battle. Her grey hair pinned severely beneath a wool hat that had seen better days. Vivian Caldwell, she announced when Vivian opened the door. I demand to know if what Doc Harrison is saying is true. Is that man really— Hello, Martha, Augustus said, stepping into view behind Vivian. It's good to see you again. Martha's stern expression crumbled like a sandcastle in the tide. Her hand flew to her throat, and for a moment Augustus thought she might faint. Then, to his surprise, tears began streaming down her weathered cheeks. Augustus Caldwell, you worthless, wonderful fool, she said, her voice breaking. Do you have any idea what your disappearance did to that poor girl? Do you know how many nights she sat in my post office, hoping for a letter that never came? Augustus felt shame wash over him like ice water. Martha, Don't you Martha me, you stubborn jackass. Margaret Pemberton was the finest woman in this valley, and she spent 23 years waiting for a ghost. Martha wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, then stepped forward and, to Augustus's amazement, pulled him into a fierce embrace. Thank God you finally came home. The emotional reunion was interrupted by the arrival of more visitors. Tom Brennan, who ran the general store, came with his wife and 3 grown children. The Millers from the adjoining farm brought fresh bread and curiosity in equal measure. Even Father McKenna, the elderly priest who'd ministered to the valley's Catholics for as long as anyone could remember, made the trip from town to see for himself. I performed Margaret's funeral service, the priest told Augustus as they stood in the parlor, surrounded by well-wishers and the curious. She made me promise that when you returned, not if, mind you, but when, I would marry you properly. Father, she said, I want to be his wife before God and man, even if I have to do it from the grave. Augustus felt his eyes burn with unshed tears. Even in death, Margaret had been planning for his return, arranging for their love to be sanctified in ways she'd never been able to accomplish in life. But not all the visitors were so welcoming. Near sunset, as the crowd began to thin, a group of men arrived on horseback that made Augustus's blood run cold. He recognized the leader immediately, Sheriff Blake Morrison, a man who'd worn a badge when Augustus had fled the valley all those years ago. Morrison was older now, his hair white and his face lined with years of hard living, but his eyes still held the same cold suspicion Augustus remembered. Behind him rode 3 deputies, all armed and wearing expressions that suggested this wasn't a social call. Augustus Caldwell, Morrison said as he dismounted, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. Been hearing some interesting stories about you today. Sheriff, Augustus replied, keeping his voice steady. It's been a long time. Not long enough, some might say. There are still folks in this valley who remember why you left. Still folks who think you got away with murder. Augustus felt Vivian step closer to him, her presence a comfort and a worry at the same time. Sheriff Morrison, she said, her voice polite but firm, my father is here as my guest. He's committed no crime that I'm aware of. Your father? Morrison's eyebrows rose. So it's true then? Margaret's girl is Augustus Caldwell's daughter. I am, Vivian said proudly, lifting her chin in a gesture that reminded Augustus powerfully of Margaret. And I'll ask you to treat him with the respect due to any citizen of this valley. Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. Citizen? Miss, your father is a wanted man. Was a wanted man anyway before the trail went cold. Murder, robbery, association with known criminals, the list was considerable. Was being the operative phrase, Vivian replied smoothly. I believe you'll find that all charges against my father were dropped years ago when the real criminals were caught and tried. The records are public, Sheriff. Perhaps you should review them. Augustus saw surprise flicker across Morrison's face, followed by something that might have been uncertainty. That's not possible. It's not only possible, it's documented fact. Vivian's voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd done her homework thoroughly. The Thornfield gang confessed to the Carson City robbery in 1865. The confession included details about framing an innocent man, specifically Augustus Caldwell. The judge who originally signed the warrant was later convicted of taking bribes from the same gang. Morrison's hand moved away from his gun, but his expression remained hostile. Even if that's true, there are other crimes. Name them, Vivian challenged. Give me specific dates, specific charges, specific evidence. Because I've spent years researching my father's case, and I can account for every allegation ever made against him. The standoff stretched taut between them, and Augustus could feel the tension crackling like electricity before a storm. Then, unexpectedly, one of Morrison's deputies cleared his throat. Sheriff, the young man said quietly, maybe we should check with the territorial marshal before we take any action. If the lady's right about the charges being dropped, I know how to do my job, Stevens. Morrison snapped, but Augustus could see doubt creeping into his eyes. After a long moment, the sheriff remounted his horse. This isn't over, Caldwell. I'll be checking those records you mentioned, Miss Vivian. And if I find out you're lying, you won't, Vivian said calmly. Because I'm not. After the lawmen rode away, Augustus sank into the rocking chair on the front porch, his legs suddenly unsteady. The confrontation had drained him more than he cared to admit, bringing back memories of the fear and uncertainty that had driven him into exile. You handled that well, he told Vivian, as she settled into the chair beside him. I've had years to prepare for that conversation, she replied. Mother always said that when you came home, there would be people who wouldn't want to believe you were innocent. She made sure I had all the documentation I'd need to prove them wrong. Augustus shook his head in wonder. She really did think of everything, didn't she? She loved you, Vivian said simply. Love makes people thorough. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled over the valley, both lost in their own thoughts. Augustus found himself studying Vivian's profile in the lamplight spilling from the windows, seeing Margaret in the curve of her cheek, his own stubborn jaw in the set of her chin. There's something else, Vivian said eventually. Something I haven't told you yet. Augustus felt his chest tighten. What? The reason I really came looking for you. The reason I need you to stay. She turned to face him, her eyes serious in the growing darkness. This place, our home, it's in danger, and I don't think I can save it alone. The next morning, Vivian spread a collection of official-looking papers across the kitchen table, like a general planning a battle. Augustus studied them over his coffee, his expression growing darker with each document he read. They call themselves the Consolidated Mining and Development Company, Vivian explained, pointing to a letterhead that appeared on most of the papers. They've been buying up land throughout the valley for the past 2 years, claiming they want to establish mining operations in the mountains. Augustus picked up a survey map that showed their property outlined in red ink. This says they've already acquired the Morrison Ranch, the Henderson Place, and most of the land along the North Ridge. They have. They make generous offers, more than the land is worth for farming or ranching. Most folks took the money and moved on. Vivian's voice carried a note of frustration. But they want our land most of all. Something about mineral rights and water access. What kind of offers are we talking about? Enough to buy a nice house in San Francisco and live comfortably for years. Vivian pulled out another document, this one bearing an official seal. This is their latest offer. 5 times what the land is worth. They've been very persistent. Augustus studied the paperwork more carefully, his old instincts stirring. Something about the whole situation felt wrong, like a card game where the deck was marked. Who's behind this company? Who are the principals? That's the interesting part. Vivian produced a folder thick with newspaper clippings and hand-copied records. The company is registered in Denver, but the actual ownership is buried under layers of shell companies and holding corporations. I've been trying to trace the real owners for months. Any luck? Some. The trail leads back to a man named Harrison Blackwell. He owns mining interests throughout Colorado and Wyoming, but he's also involved in railroad development and territorial politics. Vivian's eyes met his across the table. The name meant nothing to me until I found this. She handed him a yellowed wanted poster that made Augustus's blood freeze in his veins. The face staring back at him was older, heavier, marked by years of success and corruption, but the eyes were unmistakable. Harrison Blackwell had once been Henry Black, second in command of the Thornfield Gang. Sweet Jesus, Augustus breathed. He's supposed to be dead, killed in a shootout with territorial marshals in '67. Apparently not, from what I can piece. Together, he used the gang's stolen money to buy respectability, changed his name, moved to Denver, started legitimate businesses. Vivian's voice was tight with anger, and now he's decided he wants our land. Augustus set down the wanted poster with hands that weren't quite steady. Henry Black, Harrison. Blackwell had been the smartest and most ruthless member of the Thornfield Gang. While the others robbed banks and rustled cattle, Black had planned their operations with the precision of a military campaign. He'd also been the one who'd orchestrated Augustus's frame-up, turning him into a scapegoat when the law got too close. He knows who I am, Augustus said quietly. Has to. This isn't about mining rights or water access. This is personal. That's what I think too. Mother received the first offer just days after she mentioned to someone in town that she expected you to come home soon. Vivian gathered the papers into neat stacks. I think he's been watching, waiting. When he learned you might return, he decided to eliminate the threat. What threat? I'm just an old man who's been hiding in the mountains for 23 years. You're the only person alive who can identify him as Henry Black. You're the only one who knows about his connection to the Thornfield Gang, who can prove he built his empire on stolen money. Vivian's eyes were fierce with determination. You're the only witness to his crimes. Augustus stood and walked to the window, staring out at the peaceful valley that had become a battlefield he'd never wanted to fight on. In the distance, he could see surveyors working along the creek, men with instruments and official papers who were mapping out the destruction of everything Margaret had preserved. There's more, Vivian said quietly. The legal papers say that if I don't accept their offer by the end of this week, they'll begin eminent domain proceedings. They claim the territorial government has authorized them to seize private property for the public good. Can they do that, with the right judges and politicians in their pocket? Probably. Vivian joined him at the window. Blackwell has had years to build connections, to buy influence. He's respectable now, a pillar of the community. Who's going? To believe the word of a hermit and a spinster against a man like that? Augustus felt the familiar weight of his old gun belt, where Vivian had placed it on the table beside the papers. Margaret had saved it, along with everything else, wrapping it carefully in oiled cloth and hiding it in the back of her wardrobe. The leather was still supple, the metal bright and well-maintained. She'd cared for his weapons the way she'd cared for his memory. You could leave, Vivian said, following his gaze. Take the money and go somewhere Blackwell can't find you. Start fresh with a new name, a new life. Could you? No. Her answer was immediate and firm. This is my home. It's where my mother lived and died, where she's buried. It's where you and she were happy, even if it was only for a little while. She paused, then added softly, "It's where our family began." Augustus picked up the photograph from the mantelpiece. Margaret holding baby Vivian, both of them looking toward a future that had held such promise. This house, this land, these memories, they were all that remained of the life he'd thrown away to protect the people he loved. And now, those same people were under threat again, this time from an enemy who should have been dead and buried years ago. "He won't stop," Augustus said finally. "Even if we sell and move, Blackwell won't let it end there. He can't afford to have me alive and talking." "I know. This won't be like the old days. I'm not the man I was 23 years ago. Maybe not. But you're still my father." Vivian moved to stand beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "And I'm still Margaret's daughter. We have her strength and your stubbornness. Maybe that's enough." Augustus looked down at the young woman who carried the best of both her parents, who'd spent years preparing for this moment without knowing when or if it would come. Margaret had raised a daughter worthy of any father's pride, and Augustus felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Hope mixed with purpose. "All right," he said quietly. "We fight. Together." Augustus smiled, the expression feeling strange on his weathered face. "Together. But first, I need to teach you some things your mother couldn't." Outside, the surveyors continued their work, unaware that the sleeping giant they'd awakened was finally ready to open his eyes. The revelation came at dawn, on the third day, delivered by an unlikely messenger. Augustus was checking the horses in the barn when he heard the sound of a single rider approaching at a gallop. Through the barn door, he watched a young man dismount and hurry toward the house. His face flushed with urgency and fear. Augustus recognized him as Tommy Fletcher, Doc Harrison's apprentice, a good kid who'd been sweet on Vivian since they were children. Whatever brought him here at this hour, it wasn't good news. "Miss Vivian," Tommy called out as he pounded on the front door. "Please, I need to speak with you right away." Augustus made his way to the house as Vivian opened the door, still in her robe and clearly alarmed by the early visit. "Tommy, what's wrong? Is it Doc Harrison?" "No, ma'am." "Well, not exactly." Tommy glanced nervously at Augustus as he approached. "It's about your father, Miss Vivian. Doc sent me to warn you. There are men in town asking questions about him. Dangerous-looking men." Augustus felt ice form in his stomach. "What kind of questions?" "They wanted to know if anyone had seen Augustus Caldwell, if the stories about him coming back were true." Tommy's voice shook slightly. "Doc told them he didn't know anything, but they didn't believe him. They said they worked for someone important, someone who had unfinished business with Mr. Caldwell. Blackwell's men," Vivian said grimly. "That's not the worst part," Tommy continued, his words tumbling over each other in his haste. "I was cleaning up Doc's office last night when I heard voices outside. These same men were talking to someone else, someone they called Sheriff." Augustus exchanged a glance with Vivian. "Morrison." "That's what I thought too, but then I looked out the window." Tommy's face was pale in the morning light. "It wasn't Sheriff Morrison, Mr. Caldwell. It was someone wearing a sheriff's badge, but I'd never seen him before. And the things they were saying about how they needed to clean up loose ends, about how some problems had to be dealt with permanently." The pieces began falling into place in Augustus's mind with sickening clarity. Blackwell hadn't just been buying land, he'd been buying people. Local officials, maybe even territorial authorities. The corruption ran deeper than they'd imagined. "There's more," Tommy said, pulling a folded paper from his jacket. "I found this on Doc's desk this morning. I think one of those men dropped it." Augustus unfolded the paper and felt the world shift beneath his feet. It was a telegram dated just 2 days earlier. Caldwell confirmed alive. Stop, eliminate both targets. Stop, make it look accidental. Stop, no witnesses. Stop, HB. "Both targets," Vivian whispered, reading over his shoulder. "He's not just after me," Augustus said, his voice hollow with realization. "He's after you too." Tommy nodded miserably. "Doc says you should run, both of you. Tonight, if possible. He thinks they're planning something for tomorrow." Augustus crumpled the telegram in his fist, rage burning through him like wildfire. It was one thing for Blackwell to come after him. That was old business, a settling of accounts between enemies. But Vivian was innocent. She'd done nothing except love her parents and tried to preserve their memory. "We're not running," he said quietly. "Augustus," Vivian began. "No." His voice cut through her protest like a blade. "I ran 23 years ago, and look what it cost us. I won't run again, especially not when it means leaving you in danger." "Then what do we do?" Tommy asked. "Doc says there are at least 6 of them, maybe more. And if they've got corrupt lawmen helping them, we fight back," Augustus said simply. "But not the way they expect." He spent the rest of the morning in Margaret's study, a small room off the parlor where she'd kept her correspondence and business records. Vivian had preserved everything exactly as her mother had left it, and Augustus found himself surrounded by evidence of the life Margaret had built in his absence, but it was what he found hidden behind a loose board. In the wall that changed everything, the cash contained items Augustus had never seen before. Official documents bearing territorial seals, correspondence with federal marshals, and most shocking of all, a commission naming Margaret Pemberton as a special investigator for the territorial government. "What is this?" Vivian asked, finding him staring at the papers with amazement. "Your mother was working for the law," Augustus said slowly. "Has been for years, by the look of these dates. She was investigating corruption in the territorial government, tracking stolen money, building cases against—" He stopped, holding up a thick file. "Against Harrison Blackwell." The file contained everything: documentation of Blackwell's real identity, evidence of his connection to the Thornfield gang, financial records showing how he'd used stolen money to buy respectability. Margaret had been methodically building a case that would destroy him. She knew, Vivian breathed. She knew who was really behind the land grab. More than that, she was working with federal authorities to bring him down. Augustus found a letter dated just weeks before Margaret's death. "Look at this." She was supposed to testify before a territorial grand jury. Her evidence would have been enough to send Blackwell to the gallows, but she died before she could testify. Augustus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Tommy, that fever your mother died of, how long was she sick?" "Just a few days. It came on real sudden-like, and nothing doc tried seemed to help." Tommy paused, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You don't think—" "I think Harrison Blackwell has been eliminating threats for a very long time," Augustus said grimly. "And I think we've been fools to believe we were dealing with a simple land grab." Vivian sank into Margaret's chair, overwhelmed by the implications. "If Mother was murdered, if she died because she was trying to bring Blackwell to justice, then we finish what she started," Augustus said firmly. "But we do it smart. We do it legal. And we make sure everyone knows the truth." He found what he was looking for at the bottom of the file, a letter from a federal marshal named Samuel Hayes, dated just before Margaret's death. The marshal was expecting to hear from Margaret about her investigation, expecting evidence that would allow federal authorities to move against Blackwell. "Tommy," Augustus said, "I need you to ride to the territorial capital. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir. Doc's got a fast horse I can borrow. Find Marshal Hayes, give him this file, and tell him that Margaret Pemberton's daughter has the evidence he needs." Augustus handed over the entire cache of documents. "Tell him we'll testify, but he needs to move fast. We may not have much time," as Tommy rode away with the evidence that could destroy Blackwell. Augustus turned to find Vivian loading shells into a shotgun with practiced efficiency. "Mother taught me more than carving and cooking," she said calmly. "She said someday I might need to protect what was ours." Augustus strapped on his gun belt for the first time in 23 years, the familiar weight both comforting and sobering. The leather had been well cared for, the metal bright and ready. Margaret had preserved his weapons the way she'd preserved everything else, with faith that he would someday need them again. "How long do you think we have?" Vivian asked. "Not long. If Blackwell's men are already in the valley, they'll move soon." Augustus checked his pistol, muscle memory guiding his hands through motions he'd hoped never to need again. "The question is whether Marshal Hayes can get here before they do." Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the mountains, and Augustus could feel electricity in the air that promised lightning before the day was through. 23 years of running were about to end, one way or another. The ghost of Augustus Caldwell was finally ready to come back to life. The storm broke just after midnight, bringing with it wind that howled through the valley like the voices of the restless dead. Augustus stood at the parlor window, watching lightning illuminate the landscape in stark white flashes. Each burst of light revealed the positions of the men who surrounded their house, 6 dark shapes moving with military precision through the apple orchard and along the creek. "They're in position," he said quietly to Vivian, who was checking the loads in her mother's rifle for the 3rd time. "How many?" "6 that I can see. Probably more I can't." Augustus moved away from the window, knowing that the next lightning flash might reveal his silhouette to watching eyes. "They're being careful, professional. This isn't their first time." Vivian nodded, her face pale but determined in the lamplight. She'd changed into dark clothing and pinned her hair back severely, transforming herself from a young woman into something harder, more dangerous. Augustus recognized the look. He'd seen it in his own mirror before difficult jobs, when survival depended on becoming someone else. "The federal marshal?" she asked. "Tommy's been gone 8 hours. Even if he found Hayes immediately, it'll be dawn before they can get here." Augustus checked his pocket watch, a gift from Margaret that had somehow survived 23 years in exile. "We're on our own until then." They'd spent the evening preparing as best they could. The house was dark except for a single lamp in the kitchen, positioned to cast shadows that would confuse anyone trying to see inside. They'd moved furniture to create barricades at the windows and doors, and Vivian had filled the bathtub with water in case the attackers tried to burn them out. Augustus had also taken precautions that would have been unthinkable to his younger self. He'd written out a full confession, detailing everything he knew about Henry Black and the Thornfield gang, along with instructions for finding Margaret's hidden evidence. If they didn't survive the night, at least the truth might still see daylight. "I want you to know something," Vivian said suddenly, her voice cutting through the sound of wind and rain. "Whatever happens tonight, I'm glad you came back. I'm glad I got to know my father." Augustus felt his throat tighten. "Vivian, no, let me say this. Mother spent 23 years telling me about the man you were, the man you could be, but I needed to see for myself that her faith wasn't misplaced." She met his eyes across the dim room. "It wasn't. You're everything she said you were and more." "I'm a killer," Augustus said quietly. "I've taken more lives than I can count. That's not something to be proud of." "You're a protector," Vivian corrected firmly. "You killed bad men to save good people. There's a difference, even if it doesn't always feel like one." Thunder crashed overhead, so close that the windows rattled in their frames. In the brief silence that followed, Augustus heard something that made his blood run cold, the soft creak of a boot on the front porch. He motioned for silence and moved to the window beside the door, peering carefully through a gap in the curtains. A figure in a dark coat stood just outside, barely visible in the storm. As Augustus watched, the man raised his hand and made a series of gestures that Augustus recognized as military signals. Professional killers, then. Ex-soldiers, probably. Men who'd learned their trade in the war and sold their skills to the highest bidder afterward. Augustus had known men like that, had been one himself for a time. They were dangerous precisely because they treated killing as a job, nothing more. The attack, when it came, was swift and coordinated. The front and back doors exploded inward, simultaneously, followed by the crash of breaking glass as more men came through the windows. Augustus and Vivian had positioned themselves in the hallway between the parlor and kitchen, giving them clear fields of fire in both directions. Augustus's first shot took down the man coming through the front door, his bullet catching the intruder center mass and spinning him into the wall. Vivian's rifle boomed from behind him, and he heard a cry of pain from the kitchen as her shot found its mark. "Two down," Augustus called out, reloading with practiced speed. "At least 4 more," Vivian replied, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. Gunfire filled the house with thunder and the acrid smell of black powder. Augustus moved from position to position like a ghost, using every piece of cover the familiar rooms provided. 23 years of mountain living had kept him hard and quick, and his old skills came back as naturally as breathing. But the attackers were good, better than the usual hired guns Blackwell might have employed. They moved with discipline and coordination, covering each other's advances and maintaining communication despite the storm raging outside. Augustus realized with growing concern that they were being pushed steadily back, forced to give ground room by room. "The stairs," he told Vivian during a brief lull in the fighting. "We need higher ground." They retreated up the narrow staircase to the second floor, where the layout would force their attackers to come at them, one or two at a time. Augustus positioned himself at the top of the stairs, while Vivian covered the windows, in case anyone tried to climb up from outside. The first man up the stairs died before he made it halfway, Augustus's bullet taking him in the chest and sending him tumbling back down into his companions. The second man was smarter, using his fallen comrade's body as cover while he returned fire. "Caldwell," a voice called from downstairs. "We know you're up there. Surrender now and the girl lives." "Go to hell," Augustus shouted back, not believing the offer for a second. These men had come to eliminate witnesses, not take prisoners. "Have it your way," the voice replied. Augustus heard movement in the rooms below, followed by a new and terrifying smell. Coal oil. They were going to burn the house down around them. "The attic," Vivian said urgently. "There's a window that looks out on the barn roof." They climbed the narrow ladder to the cramped space under the eaves, where Augustus could see Margaret's careful organization, even in their desperate circumstances. Boxes of clothes and household items were neatly labeled and stacked, preserving the memories of a life well lived. The attic window was small, but would be large enough for them to squeeze through. Outside, the barn roof stretched below them, slick with rain, but offering a possible escape route. The drop to the ground from the barn's edge would be dangerous, but survivable. Smoke was beginning to seep through the floorboards when Augustus heard something that made his heart leap with hope. The sound of many horses approaching at speed, their hoofbeats audible even over the storm. "Federal marshals!" a powerful voice bellowed from outside. "Surrender your weapons and come out with your hands visible." The gunfire from below ceased abruptly, replaced by the sounds of men moving quickly and quietly. Augustus heard whispered curses and the scrape of boots on wood as Blackwell's hired killers tried to decide whether to fight or run. "This is Marshal Hayes," the voice continued. "The house is surrounded. You have 30 seconds to throw down your weapons." Augustus and Vivian descended from the attic to find their attackers gone, vanished into the storm as quickly as they'd appeared. Smoke still rose from the oil-soaked floors downstairs, but the fire hadn't yet taken hold. "Marshal Hayes," Augustus called out. "Augustus Caldwell, we're coming down." They emerged from the house to find themselves surrounded by a dozen federal marshals, all armed and ready for trouble. At their head stood a tall man with graying hair and eyes like steel, his badge gleaming wetly in the lantern light. "Mr. Caldwell," Marshal Hayes said, extending his hand. "I'm sorry we're late. Young Fletcher found me just as I was leaving for the territorial capital. When he told me what was happening here, I gathered every available man and rode through the night. The attackers, gone but not far. We'll track them down." Hayes surveyed the damaged house with professional interest. "But first, I need to hear your story. Fletcher gave me some of your mother's evidence, Miss Vivian, but I need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with." As dawn broke over the valley, painting the storm clouds in shades of gold and rose, Augustus found himself sitting at the kitchen table once again. But this time, instead of reading Margaret's journals and evidence in secret, he was sharing them with a federal marshal who had the authority to act on what they revealed. The nightmare was almost over, but Augustus had learned long ago that almost was a dangerous word, especially when dealing with men like Harrison Blackwell. The final confrontation was still to come. The final confrontation came 3 days later. not in the remote valley where Augustus had expected it, but in the territorial courthouse in Helena, where justice moved with the ponderous weight of law rather than the swift violence of vengeance. Augustus stood at the witness stand, his hand resting on the leather-bound Bible, and faced the man who'd stolen 23 years of his life. Harrison Blackwell sat at the defendant's table in an expensive suit, his silver hair perfectly groomed, looking every inch the respectable businessman he'd pretended to be. Only his eyes betrayed him, cold and calculating. The same predator's gaze Augustus remembered from their days riding with the Thornfield gang. "State your name for the record," the prosecutor instructed. "Augustus Caldwell," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. Blackwell's lawyer immediately objected. "Your Honor, this man is testifying under an assumed name. His real name is Augustus Bennett, and he's been a fugitive from justice for over 2 decades. Judge Richardson, a stern-faced man with white whiskers, consulted the papers before him. Mr. Caldwell's legal status has been clarified by federal authorities. All charges against him have been dismissed based on new evidence. He may testify under his legal name." "Proceed, Mr. Prosecutor." Augustus felt a moment of profound relief. Marshal Hayes had been as good as his word. The federal investigation had not only cleared Augustus of all past charges, but had also provided him with legal protection. As a key witness in the case against Blackwell, "Mr. Caldwell," the prosecutor continued, "please tell the court about your association with the defendant." Augustus looked directly at Blackwell as he spoke. "I knew him as Henry Black, second in command of the Thornfield gang. We rode together for 6 months in 1858 before I learned what kind of men they really were." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Blackwell's carefully constructed reputation was crumbling with every word, and Augustus could see panic beginning to crack his composed facade. "You're lying," Blackwell snarled, half rising from his chair before his lawyer pulled him back down. "Order." Judge Richardson banged his gavel. "The defendant will remain silent or be removed from this courtroom." Augustus continued his testimony methodically, describing the gang's operations, their methods, and most damning of all, the way Henry Black had orchestrated the Carson City bank robbery that had been pinned on Augustus when he tried to leave the gang. "He told me it was insurance," Augustus said, "that if I ever tried to expose him or the gang, I'd hang for their crimes. When I fell in love with Margaret Pemberton and tried to build an honest life, he made good on that threat." The prosecutor introduced Margaret's evidence piece by piece, financial records showing how Blackwell had used stolen money to establish his mining empire, correspondence proving his real identity, and testimony from other witnesses who'd come forward once they learned it was safe to speak. But it was Vivian's testimony that proved most powerful. She took the stand wearing Margaret's blue dress, the one her mother had been married in, and spoke with quiet dignity about a lifetime of watching her mother wait for a man who'd sacrificed everything to protect his family. "My mother never stopped believing in Augustus Caldwell's innocence," Vivian said, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. "She spent 23 years gathering evidence, building a case, waiting for the chance to clear his name. She died before she could see justice done. But she made sure I had everything needed to finish what she started." When Blackwell's defense attorney tried to discredit her testimony, suggesting she was merely a bitter daughter seeking revenge, Vivian's response silenced the courtroom. "I'm not seeking revenge, sir. I'm seeking truth. There's a difference." The trial lasted 4 days, with witness after witness taking the stand to describe Blackwell's corruption, his threats, his use of violence to silence opposition. Sheriff Morrison, faced with federal charges for his own cooperation with Blackwell, had turned state's evidence and provided detailed testimony about the conspiracy to steal Valley land through intimidation and fraud. But the moment that sealed Blackwell's fate came when Marshal Hayes presented the court with evidence found during raids on Blackwell's properties, including the original Thornfield gang's stolen loot, still hidden in secret compartments of his Denver mansion, as the marshal displayed bags of gold coins, jewelry, and bearer bonds that had been stolen decades earlier. Blackwell finally lost his composure entirely. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he shouted, lunging to his feet despite his lawyer's restraining hand. "I built an empire. I made something of myself. I won't let some mountain hermit and his bastard daughter destroy everything I've worked for." "Order!" Judge Richardson's gavel cracked like a gunshot. A bailiff restrained the defendant. As court officers moved to control Blackwell, Augustus caught sight of something that made his blood freeze. Blackwell's hand had moved to his coat pocket, and Augustus saw the glint of metal, a derringer, small enough to conceal but deadly at close range. "Gun!" Augustus shouted, vaulting over the witness stand railing. The courtroom exploded into chaos as Augustus tackled Blackwell, just as the hidden pistol fired. The bullet going wide and shattering a window instead of finding its intended target, Vivian, who sat in the front row of the gallery. In the struggle that followed, 23 years of mountain living proved decisive. Augustus pinned Blackwell to the floor while marshals swarmed around them, finally placing the man who'd stolen his life in shackles that would never be removed. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with their verdict. When the foreman stood to announce their decision, the packed courtroom fell silent with anticipation. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Margaret Pemberton, we find the defendant guilty. On the charges of fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of their lawful property, we find the defendant guilty. On the charges related to the defendant's activities as a member of the Thornfield gang, including robbery and conspiracy to frame an innocent man, we find the defendant guilty on all counts. Judge Richardson accepted the verdict with solemn dignity, then turned his attention to sentencing. Harrison Blackwell, you stand convicted of crimes spanning more than 2 decades. Your actions destroyed lives, corrupted institutions, and perverted the very concept of justice this court represents. Blackwell stood between 2 marshals, his expensive suit wrinkled from the earlier struggle, his silver hair disheveled. But his eyes still burned with the same cold hatred that Augustus remembered from their outlaw days. You have betrayed every trust placed in you, corrupted every position you held, and shown no remorse for the suffering you caused. The judge's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. I hereby sentence you to death by hanging, sentence to be carried out within 30 days. The courtroom erupted in voices, some shouting approval, others expressing shock at the severity of the sentence. Augustus felt no satisfaction in the verdict. Only a bone-deep weariness that came from seeing a long nightmare finally reach its end. As marshals led Blackwell away, the condemned man turned to fix Augustus with one last, malevolent stare. "This isn't over, Caldwell," he said, his voice carrying despite the noise around them. "I've got friends you don't know about, people who owe me favors." "It's over," Augustus replied quietly. "You're done hurting people. We'll see about that." The words sent a chill through Augustus, but Marshal Hayes appeared at his side before he could dwell on them. "Don't let him get in your head," the marshal said firmly. "Blackwell's finished. His network is broken, his assets seized, his influence gone. He's just a desperate man making empty threats. Are you sure about that?" "As sure as I can be. We've been investigating his operation for months, ever since your mother's evidence first reached federal authorities." Hayes handed Augustus an official-looking document. "This should put your mind at ease." Augustus read the paper with growing amazement. It was a presidential pardon, signed by President Arthur himself, officially clearing Augustus of all past charges and restoring his full rights as a citizen. "Margaret's evidence didn't just help us convict Blackwell," Hayes explained. "It exposed a network of corruption that reached all the way to territorial officials in Washington. The president wanted to make sure that everyone involved in bringing this conspiracy to light was protected." Vivian appeared at Augustus's side, her face glowing with pride and relief. "Is it really over?" "It's over," Augustus confirmed, folding the pardon carefully and placing it in his jacket pocket. "We can go home." They left Helena the next morning, traveling by train as far as Millbrook, then taking a wagon for the final miles to their valley. The journey that had once taken Augustus days of hard riding through mountain passes now seemed almost impossibly swift and comfortable. As they crested the ridge that overlooked their homestead, Augustus felt his heart swell with emotions he couldn't name. The house stood exactly as they'd left it, its white walls gleaming in the afternoon sun, smoke rising from the chimney where neighbors had been keeping the fires burning in their absence. "Look," Vivian said, pointing toward the front gate. A small crowd had gathered in the yard. Doc Harrison, Martha Henley, the Brennan family, and a dozen other neighbors who'd come to welcome them home. Someone had strung bunting between the apple trees, and Augustus could smell fresh bread and roasting meat on the afternoon breeze. "They've planned a celebration," Vivian said, tears shining in her eyes. "They're celebrating you," Augustus corrected. "You're the one who never gave up, who kept your mother's memory alive, who had the courage to come looking for a ghost in the mountains." "We did it together," Vivian replied firmly. "All three of us, you, me, and Mother. She may not be here to see it, but this victory belongs to her, too." As their wagon rolled through the gate and into the yard full of friends and neighbors, Augustus felt something he hadn't experienced in 23 years, the simple, profound joy of coming home. The applause and cheers that greeted them seemed to wash away the last traces of his exile, replacing them with acceptance and belonging. Doc Harrison was the first to reach them, his weathered face split by a huge grin. "Welcome home, Augustus Caldwell," he said, extending his hand. "It's about damn time." "It's good to be home, Doc," Augustus replied, and meant it with every fiber of his being. For the first time since he'd walked away from this valley as a young man, Augustus Caldwell was exactly where he belonged. Spring came early to the valley that year, as if the land itself was eager to begin anew. Augustus stood in the doorway of the barn, watching Vivian work in the garden where Margaret had once tended her vegetables and flowers. 3 months had passed since the trial. 3 months of rebuilding more than just the physical damage to their home. The bullet holes in the walls had been patched and painted over, the broken windows replaced with new glass that sparkled in the morning sun. But the deeper repairs to trust, to hope, to the possibility of family, had taken longer and required more careful attention. Augustus had carved a new sign for the front gate, the letters cut deep in seasoned oak and painted in bold black, Bennett Family Homestead. The name felt right, honoring both his mountain solitude and the family bond he'd discovered with Vivian. It was a name that spoke of permanence, of roots planted deep enough to weather any storm. "The apple trees are budding early this year," Vivian called out, straightening from her work among the tomato seedlings. "Mother always said that was a sign of good luck." "Your mother was right about a lot of things," Augustus replied. Walking over to join her in the garden, they worked together in comfortable silence, father and daughter, learning each other's rhythms the way partners do. Augustus had discovered that Vivian had inherited his patience along with Margaret's grace, making her an ideal companion for the quiet work of coaxing life from the soil. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both look up. A single rider was coming down the valley road, and Augustus felt a familiar tension coil in his stomach before he recognized the familiar figure of Tommy Fletcher. "Morning, Mr. Caldwell. Miss Vivian," Tommy called out as he dismounted at the gate. "Got some news from town I thought you'd want to hear." "Good news or bad?" Vivian asked, brushing dirt from her hands. "Good, I'd say." "Real good." Tommy's grin was wide enough to split his face. "Harrison Blackwell was hanged yesterday morning in Helena. Doc got the telegram this morning." Augustus felt a weight he hadn't realized he was still carrying suddenly lift from his shoulders. "Any trouble? Any sign of those friends he claimed to have?" "None. Marshal Hayes was there for the execution, and he sent word that Blackwell's whole organization has collapsed. The territorial governor himself issued a statement saying that corruption at every level is being rooted out." Tommy paused, then added with obvious satisfaction, "Sheriff Morrison's been replaced too. The new man's honest as the day is long, according to Doc." "Thank you for bringing the news, Tommy," Augustus said. There's more. The territorial legislature voted to compensate families who lost property to Blackwell's schemes. You'll be getting a check for damages, plus interest for all the years you were wrongfully forced into exile. Vivian looked at Augustus with surprise. We don't need the money. No, but we've earned it, Augustus replied. And maybe we can use it to help others who weren't as fortunate as we were. After Tommy left, Augustus and Vivian walked to the family cemetery behind the house. The spring grass was already growing green around the headstones, and someone, probably Martha Henley, had planted wildflowers around Margaret's grave. I wish she could have seen this, Vivian said, kneeling to arrange the fresh daisies she'd brought from the garden. She did see it, Augustus said quietly. Every plan she made, every piece of evidence she gathered, every day she kept faith that justice would come. She saw this moment and worked toward it. They stood together in the peaceful silence of the cemetery, 3 generations of Caldwells finally at rest in the place they'd chosen as home. Augustus could almost feel Margaret's presence, a warmth in the spring air that seemed to whisper approval and love. I've been thinking, Vivian said, as they walked back toward the house, about the future, about what we want to build here. What kind of thinking? The valley needs a school. Most of the children have to travel 20 miles to get any education, and some families can't afford to send them that far. Vivian's eyes were bright with possibility. We have the land, we have the resources now, and I have the education to teach. Mother always said this place should serve the community. Augustus smiled, seeing Margaret's generous spirit alive and thriving in their daughter. What would you need? A building, books, supplies, maybe room for a dozen students to start with. Vivian paused, then added shyly, and maybe someday a teacher's family of my own. Augustus raised an eyebrow. Anyone in particular in mind? Tommy Fletcher's been very attentive lately. He's a good man, and he understands what this place means to me. And what does this place mean to you? Vivian considered the question seriously, looking out over the valley that had shaped her entire life. Home, she said finally. Not just the house and land, but the idea that some things are worth preserving, worth fighting for. That love can survive separation and time and even death if it's strong enough and true enough. That evening, Augustus sat on the front porch in the rocking chair he'd built for Margaret so many years ago. Vivian was inside, working on lesson plans for the school she'd decided to start in the fall. The sounds of domestic life, the scratch of her pen, the tick of the mantel clock, the whisper of pages turning, created a peaceful symphony that spoke of continuity and hope. In his pocket, Augustus carried 2 items that had become talismans of his new life. One was the presidential pardon that had officially restored his identity and rights. The other was Margaret's wedding ring, which he wore now on a chain around his neck, close to his heart where it belonged. Some mistakes follow you to the grave, Augustus had once believed. But he'd learned something different in these mountains, in this valley, in the love of the family he'd thought lost forever. Some mistakes can be forgiven, some wounds can heal, and some prodigal sons can find their way home again. The past would always be part of him, but it no longer defined him. Augustus Caldwell had finally stopped running, and in stopping, he discovered that everything he'd ever wanted had been waiting for him right here, in the place where love had first taken root and somehow managed to grow. Despite all the years of separation and silence, tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new opportunities to build something lasting and good. But tonight, Augustus was content to sit in his rocking chair, listening to his daughter plan lessons for children not yet born, and feeling Margaret's presence in every whisper of wind through the apple trees. He was home. Finally, completely, irrevocably home.